All righty. Maddie. Oh my god, we just did Swamp. Wasn't that amazing, y'all? Like, it was very swampy, very real, very awesome, dude. Thank you all so much for being here again, giving us all your time and effort. We have, wow, 3 people. Love it. That's like 300 my world. Thank you all so much for being here. For those that are just coming on, my name is Ethan Persico. I am the Artistic Director of Theatre You Know and the facilitator of the Playwrights in a Residence program, a program where we're developing new plays. We need to get new plays out there, and it's absolutely incredible what we've been able to come up with. Simple acknowledgement. I'd like to take some time to acknowledge the land that we are on, traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Wendat, the Song of the First Credit, Haudenosaunee, and many other Indigenous peoples recorded and unrecorded. Had a lot of Indigenous people in my life who I care for deeply, and thus I return that reciprocity back to this company. We are streaming on YouTube Live. Thank you all so much for being here. I hope you can hear me, and I am not muted, which is great. If you feel moved by what you are experiencing tonight, we have a donation link. Please consider supporting us. You can go to our Instagram at theater_ya_KNOWWW, like the World Wide Web. And there's a donation link in our link tree, so feel free to donate to there. That's what makes this possible. We can pay artists, provide resources for development, and keep this space open for emerging voices. I want to say finally thank you to our brilliant teams, writers, performers, and tech team. We are in Gouna Library. Huge shout out to Gouna Library. Thank you so much for hosting us. And to our audience, you for showing up with open hearts and curious minds. Now, let's begin. We now move into National Nihilism by Grant Faulkson, a biting dystopian monologue set in the ruins of a failed democracy. Or rather, series of monologues. Through the eyes of Christine Marrow, a once principled journalist turned mouthpiece for a misogynistic regime, we witness the terrifying slow slide into authoritarianism. It's not a warning, it's a reflection. The official summary from our playwright is as follows. Set in a crumbling post-democracy known as the British Republics of Britain and Wales, National Nihilism is a dystopian monologue chronicling the rise of a violent misogynistic regime known as the Incel Party. Through the eyes of Christine Marrow, a once principled journalist turned reluctant mouthpiece for a collapsing nation, we are taken through a harrowing autopsy of political apathy, radicalization, and institutional rot. I will read very brief stage directions, but I also think there's not too many, so we might just skip over them, not because they're not important. I want you to hear these lovely actors. Without further ado, here are the actors performing in the premiere stage reading of National Nihilism. Come on down to The Price is Right. If folks feel comfortable, feel free to say your name, your pronouns if you're comfortable, and the role that you're playing, and like hi to the audience.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maddie Silfarski, and my pronouns are she, her, and I am playing one of the many Christines.
Hi, I'm Maya Leworthy, she, her pronouns, also playing one of the many Christines.
Hi, I'm Lexa. My pronouns are she, her, and I am too, shocker, playing one of the Christines.
Hello, my name is Colleen. My pronouns are she, they, and you guessed it, Christine.
Amazing. And hi, I'm Ethan. I'm not playing Christine, but being stage. Directions. All right, let's get her started. Okay, National Nihilism, a political testament concerning the ruling Incel Party of the British Republics of Britain and Wales, 2042 to 2045. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. T.S. Eliot. A table sits on stage, surrounded by boxes containing files. After a moment, a journalist called Christine Marrow walks onto stage holding a photograph in her hand. Christine sits and composes herself before holding up the photo of a man's face in profile.
This is Carlos Ingluder, the leader of the ruling party of the Joint Republics of Britain and Wales from 2042 to 2045. a period for women of sheer terror when policies were introduced to popular acclaim and distinct lack of opposition globally. When, despite women being allowed to be in the cabinet and the leading members of the party to have well-kept wives, mothers, secret lovers, daughters, and daughters, women were declassified as non-human. Rape was encouraged, private property confiscated, and millions died. Before we get into the murderous crimes of this hideous regime, we need to explore the origins of how the Incel Party came into power, and even more incredible, how it remained in power for 3 years despite all the bloodletting and violence it unleashed.
In the West, the 90s, for the most part, were, by general standards, halcyon days. The doomsday clock was the furthest from midnight. Toleration of the LGBTQ community seemed greater, as did all forms of toleration of the other. The end of the Cold War seemed to promote peace, and the world was coming out of recessions. Now, before we go on, I say this exclusively about the West because this was certainly not the case globally. North Korea experienced a horrendous famine. Concentration camps and ethnic cleansing were being conducted in mainland Europe. Brutal civil wars were being fought in Nepal, Lebanon, Peru. Russia fought a violent, bloody war against Chechnya. These are just some examples. But for the West Halcyon they were, and like all days of happiness and security, the seeds for the coming devastation were being sown. The greed by the bankers resulting in the crash, the stupidity of the conservative government of the UK in mass privatization, and the naivety in trusting China and taking corrupt Russian money paved the way to the nihilism that was to follow 50 years later.
Pause.
The economic crash of 2007 to 2010, caused by greed triggered in those Halcyon days I just described, brought misery and poverty to millions. One result of this crash in the West was, for the first time on record, not only were the newer generation quality of life guaranteed to be worse off than their predecessors, but the rise in the living rates.
The amount of time a person lives forestalled and eventually began to roll back. These are all the attributing factors in suicide being the biggest killer in all men aged between 18 and 34.
You see this age group, nihilism, feudalism, existentialism, call it what you will. This rot had begun to set in. So many felt helpless, felt they could not provide, and perhaps most devastating of all, felt that they had no future. The sexist, misogynistic way all societies are set up meant that men felt this pain harder, or at least they themselves perceived the pain harder, as they felt more of a sense of failure for not performing, for not achieving. This, of course, was only the beginning. Had successive governments not continued to squeeze the poor whilst letting the mega-rich, whose incomes all grew exponentially, off the hook, then I genuinely don't think any of the nightmares that were to come would have happened. But, of course, they didn't. Conservative governments continued austerity and in the process forced millions into poverty and illegally culled many disabled people by cutting their benefits and driving them onto early graves. Blood on their hands they will never be able to wash off. Things were already dire, and then COVID, caused by China, who were never going to accept responsibility, so each nation had to burden the blame. Oh, sorry, I am jumping the gun. A quick mention about President Trump, the mainstream Republican Party being hijacked by a man who encouraged a coup attempt on the nation's capital and further erosion of traditional values. He also appointed the judges who outnumbered the Democrat judges and were able to criminalize abortion. This process also occurred pretty much simultaneously in Poland. This was the first big public assault on the rights of women. Without these countries, particularly the US, greenlighting the notion that women do not have control over their bodies, that allowed the dehumanization of women as human beings that followed in the incel party.
Now, what do we mean by incel? The term originated, we believe, on the dark web in the United States. It's an abbreviation of involuntarily celibate. These men, whose frustration with their inability to get laid, they blame entirely on external factors rather than looking to themselves and thus arriving at the conclusion that rape is okay. It's not our fault we can't fuck, so let's take it. To arrive at this conclusion means you've already devalued the woman, so she's no longer human. Your feelings of sexual frustration are more important than her feelings of safety, or indeed than the pain any rape victim will have to suffer for the rest of their lives. You can begin to see in the United States various misogynistic forces coming together. The incel movement on the dark web, the repeal of Roe v. Wade, male frustration.
Apologies. I just got a comment that there's no sound at the moment for some reason. I just want to figure that out. Because I do see it making the greeny kind of thingy. I know we have other folks here in the participant. So sorry to do this. I just don't want to like read a whole thing and then, right? But yeah, if anyone else is noticing any sound issues, please let me know. Can all of you just do like test or something, maybe one at a time?
Test. 1, 2, test.
Test. 1, 2, test.
Test. 1, 2, test.
Test. 1, 2, test.
Yeah, it might just be needing to. If I were to bring it even. Oh, okay. Let's actually not move it like that. Let's move it like this. I think, yep, we're gonna make it stammer like that, but that's fine. I can also get rid of I don't need to charge it anymore. I think we'll be okay. I say that and then it might just be, if we do test again.
Test. 1, 2, test.
Test. 1, 2, test.
Test. 1, 2, test.
Test. 1, 2, test.
It is picking up. Hoping that it's avoided. I will quickly take a pause. Sorry, team. I mean, it was. Okay, I got confirmation from our lovely playwright that the sound is good, so.
Amazing.
we're
Thanks,
good.
Grant.
Hey, Grant.
All right, shall we continue, my friends? Thank you so much. All right, back to national nihilism, am I right?
Yes.
All right, continue, so sorry.
Male frustration had always been far more violent in the United States due to the easily access to guns. Although this is partially encouraged by the state, the NRA want both sides to buy the guns, the bad people and the good people to defend themselves. Paranoia is an essential component for any capitalist country. This is why newspapers always have bad news headlines, more people take note. Of course, there are other reasons in the US, such as the privatized prison systems all play a part in allowing access to weapons. But anyway, I feel we're getting off topic. Needless to say, the environment was there to birth the incel movement in the US and means to allow them to communicate, grow, and encourage them to rape women. Now we've established that the incels have begun to spread their toxic views. The global economy had crashed, causing mass poverty for the poor, sick, and vulnerable. But like that, 3 ingredients needed for fire, there was one more thing needed to happen: mass disillusionment with mainstream political parties.
2016 was not Trump's first attempt to run for president, although it was his first with the Republican Party. Between the late 90s and his 2014-15 campaigning, the cancer had spread throughout even the most ardent sticklers for tradition, i.e. the Republicans, that he was able to not only capture but pretty much single-handedly transform this ancient, successful, longest reigning party in American politics into a personality cult. This tells us how deep this disillusionment went. The failure in the UK was different. The Conservative Party dabbled with the personality cult of Boris Johnson, a man woefully inept and out of his depth for the job, a man who also was lazy and corrupt, and this ended in disaster. So you have a string of successive, unpopular, failing conservative-led governments preserving the wealth of the rich while simultaneously stamping on the faces of the poor and sick, refusing to make the wealthy pay any more, and who can blame them? the responsibility is only partially theirs. The failing of successive labor shadow governments to get elected are also responsible. In the end, rather than the Conservatives consolidate power, they merely alienated the masses and had laid the groundwork for the incel party by hollowing out various democratic institutions and also by allowing the anti-abortion rules to slowly creep in through the back door. This happened in various ways. One was health visitors to pregnant women were encouraged to keep files, and if the pregnant woman drank alcohol, this could be used against her if ever a case was built. Legally, a fetus is not meant to have any rights until birth, so this intrusion could only be as a result of the reversal of the policy. Also, certain MPs felt comfortable expressing their anti-abortion views publicly, including cabinet ministers.
Slowly, the creeping hollowing out of women's rights was happening here. Of course, this shouldn't be such a shock, as Catholic Ireland legalized abortion before British Northern Ireland. British-run Gibraltar still hasn't.
Pause.
The foundations for events are always laid well in advance. For years, the Conservatives and all other right-wing parties, in coordination with the right-wing media, which equates to about 95% of the media, began a campaign to stigmatize those on benefits, implying, amazingly, without a sense of irony, that benefit cheats were everywhere, whilst simultaneously getting the taxpayers to provide money for multiple royal weddings. The reason for these stigmas was so that when the government would act indiscriminately towards the disabled, there would be little backlash aside from the usual places. The bedroom tax could only follow from horror stories of benefit cheats and a plethora of TV programs about benefit cheats. Benefit cheats interestingly account for less than 1% of all claimants. The attention convicted most people. It was somewhere around 62%. Under the Cameron government, great overtures were made to China, presumably as the UK was hovering close to bankruptcy after the crash. Presumably, she was kept afloat by China, illegal Russian fortunes pouring into London, and a punishing financial cut to welfare, social care, and the NHS. After all, millionaires go private. The pro-Chinese course ended and was even reversed by the time of Boris Johnson's tenure, when racist Chinese rhetoric became standard fare, presumably under the guidance of the United States, which sensed the time for a showdown with China was looming ever closer. By this, we mean a real showdown, not the dotard musings of a weak and crumbling Russian empire pretending like the UK. Until recently, it was still some kind of powerful world leader, but a real showdown between the two superpowers, with the Taiwan as presumed flashpoint. Now, why do I mention this? Because this played into the sense of nihilism that by the mid-2020s had invaded every aspect of life. It became meaningless to many, and also helped set the scene for the feminine genocide that was to come with the incel party. The paranoia that had begun and nurtured in the 2020s accelerated into the 2030s. At this point, I'd like to introduce a word which, of course, played into every aspect of daily life and was a huge part of the paranoia.
Woke.
The importance of this word, perhaps the most important new word of the 21st century, a word that seemed to have a multitude of meanings, originated roughly 100 years before another word which was a new word that defined the previous century, fascism. Now, the principles of woke are common sense, you'd think. Being aware of other people and being kind. But we already have the words being aware of other people, being and kind. I don't want to stray too much into this word, which, like fascism, communism, anarchism, conservatism, or religion, you will either see it as wonderful or subversive, good or evil. There's no middle ground, perfect word for this period of our history when the center ground had eroded. The entire planet was becoming polarized. Both those who are part of woke culture and those who reactionary elements oppose it, both sides felt a sense of the apocalyptic. Both sides felt the other side was evil Both sides felt the future lay on their shoulders.
It was a deeply religious time, even though there was no religion, ironically proving that religion is not the cause of all evils. The nihilistic zeal in which, for example, Extinction Rebellion protesters lay in the road became a sense of the end of the days was coming, was totally akin to those who immigrated and to those who lived in the crazy cult of the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster. They all believed the last days were here. The real man, Jesus Christ, not the fictional Son of God, the man who led a rebellion convinced he was the Messiah and the end of the world was round the corner, was just the latest in the line of Jewish figures convinced they were the Messiah, going back to the previous 100 years, of which John the Baptist is probably the second most famous. It is not linked to religion, not even linked to nationalism or ideology, and yet it is religious in its extremist, us and them, the other as evil.
Another example, of course, is the atrocities committed by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. The same as the atrocities committed in Ukraine by the Soviet Russia. Yet Russia is now a religious society led by Eastern Orthodox churches, whereas previously it committed the atrocities led by atheist communism. The destructive force is inhuman. We just cloak it in bullshit ideologies. All ideologies are meaningless. All religions are meaningless. We invent these because we just can't accept it's us. The fascism of the French Revolution, the Spanish Inquisition, all the same. Religious without religion.
Pause.
The most downtrodden group in human history is women. All women suffer disproportionately more in all societies. This is fact. Despite protest from some quarters, it has been easier and more long-lasting to push through LGBTQ rights in the West than women's rights. The winding back of abortion was sadly not the beginning, because so many countries hadn't even legalized it. By the time of the rights reversal, once women had been stripped of control of their rights, then the threat of rape became even more toxic and terrifying. The anti-abortion laws, when you think about it, in the US, don't even make sense. Because disproportionately, ethnic groups have more children. The white, WASPSs, in the Republican Party are just speeding up the party's demise by making it illegal. Therefore, the only conclusion one can come to is that the need to limit women's freedoms, to control women by men through either fear or perhaps even genuine hatred of women, can be a more important drive for the Republican Party than other provincial parties than its own survival.
We will never know for certain.
Sorry, I apologize. Pause. Christine smiles a somber thought.
We will never know for certain. But I think it stands to reason that the first person ever murdered by Homo sapiens,
Was a male killing a female.
Christine remains composure.
One of the really sad truths we have already touched upon is the female involvement with the incel party. There were women in this government, as extraordinary as that sounds. One of the sad truths, which stings in my throat, believe me, is that some of the worst misogynists you will encounter are women.
Some of the worst misogynists you encounter are women?
Some of the worst misogynists you'll ever encounter are women.
some of the worst misogynistics you will encounter are women.
Take a look at the massive protesters outside an abortion clinic. They're women. Some women were not only complicit with the incel party's murderous regime, but actively encouraged and supported it. Money was, as always, the biggest factor in the social upheaval. Just like the French Revolution, the rise of Nazi Germany, and the end of serfdom in England.
The poor had been growing ever poorer since the crash of 07-08.
This moment was the moment Western democracies had begun to die and authoritarianism began to grow, like weeds all over the West.
Brexit was attributed primarily to austerity, money. Poverty, despite broken promises after broken promises, grew throughout the 2030s. A decade before, 2035, it would have been unthinkable for a conservative government voting for a republic and end the monarchy. But the death of the king in 2029 and the realization with most of the population that they are an expense and an anachronism we can no longer afford caused the vote which, for such a big issue, received unanimous support in both houses. Not that the monarchy will ever go being like the largest landowners in the UK, a newborn republic, especially one without a written constitution. In hard economic times, it meant easy prey to a dictator. But the first past the post system kept minority parties in place, with a strong nascent community party picking up a few MPs. A snap election in 2037 was won surprisingly by a coalition led by a resurgent Liberal Democrats, in coalition with minority parties, including the Communists. One of the first changes to the law this coalition made was the change to the first past the post system, to make it easier for a minority party to rule the new fledgling United Kingdom Republic.
Pause.
It was now only a matter of time.
Christine picks the photo of Carlos Aglander back up and looks at it for a moment. A bitter smile erupts on her face before she puts the image back down.
Carlos Aglander. We don't know much about him, really. I mean, we have an awful lot of political spin, but few truths. We have fragments from diary entries, which I shall read out later. Other than that, we have very little. He was one of those men without friends. What we do know is before he led his party out of nowhere, he made contact with like-minded men on the dark web. We also know roughly where he worked. I say roughly because we know he had a job doing something in the arts. That's it. We don't know what. We assume theater, but as what? For how long? Maybe it wasn't even theater. Maybe he performed a one-man show at the Edinburgh Fringe that nobody came to see. Maybe he worked at the front of house in a regional theater somewhere. We don't know. What we do know is that he was a short man, 5'4". Short man syndrome often applied to men who make up for their diminutive stature and presumably small penises. Interesting side note, it has been established taller men do have a privilege in terms of jobs and sexual attention. Both these would have played into the incel mindset. And another slightly longer side note to bring in is the relationship each man has to his penis.
Penis size, whether heterosexual or homosexual, relations doesn't really matter unless the person is remarkably big or small. Most people fit into the average category, and therefore it's no issue. However, far more important is whether the man perceives his penis to be big or small. The foundation for the man's ego, acceptance of self, security, and happiness are determined by whether or not he thinks he has a big penis. The penis is the building block for all men's psychological foundation, even though unless huge or micro, it doesn't really matter. And of course, there are exceptions to this rule. If the man is a misogynist, for example, he wants a small penis. But even then, it's a want, a desire. Anyway, if a man thinks his penis is big, he's happy and secure. If he thinks it's small, he feels insecure, and the latent misogynistic tendencies in all males comes to the fore. I am sure you've all heard of the term big dick energy. Now, Carlos, the head of the movement, is a classic example of someone who at least perceived himself to have a small penis, thus activating the latent misogynistic tendencies. He also presumably struggled in life.
Perhaps even more so in an industry such as the arts. He met like-minded men in the corners of the dark web, and we have the makings of a man who led the movement from the founding of the party until his suicide. At this point, it's important we remember that Carlos died by his own hand, knowing he was going to the Hague. There are, of course, still conspiracy theories, some of which have even been picked up by media outlets that really ought to know better than sow the sort of disinformation about a man who killed so many women. He is dead. He took his own life. The organization of the Incel Party is comparable to the National Socialist Party of Germany, in that it was based solely around the leader. This position was irreplaceable. It was a movement that lived and died with the leader, unlike, say, Stalinism or Leninism, which could be replaced and evolve. Also, the death cult aspects of Nazism were very much a part of the Incel Party ideology. The enemy within, most famously for the Nazi Germany, being Jews, with the Incel Party, of course, it was women. Both rebirthed their economies through confiscation of property and violence. Both initially were admired globally. It seems humankind is destined to never learn.
Human thinking never changes. We merely change the wallpaper.
For many centuries, all the ills of the world were blamed on one thing: God. Now, it's climate change. There is no such thing as a permanent revolution, and it's folly for us to believe that in hundreds of years' time, our thinking even about things that appear so certain and constant now won't be treated with laughter and contempt. The lessons of Nazism, communism, fascism, neoliberalism, insulism, these won't be the words to describe the regimes of the future. There will be new words. But every one of us here tonight, in this room, will be able to recognize the intent and the structures.
Pause.
I'm sorry, I'm straying off point. To return to Carlos, in normal times, a man like Carlos Englander would never lead a movement to government. It takes extraordinarily bad times. The total lack of faith in American democracy that birthed Trumpism as mass movement, or the collapse of Italy after World War I that birthed fascism. These are extraordinarily bad times. The UK had been going downhill faster and faster since the crash of the early 21st century. Not only in terms of the country becoming bankrupt, but also the distrust in government and the cruelty demonstrated towards the poor, sick, and infirm.
By the time the NHS was officially replaced by a Nordic-style insurance system in the early 2030s, there was nothing but hatred towards the Conservative government. And of course, this led to the resurgence of the Liberal Democrats and even the growth of a nascent parliamentary Communist Party. The collapse of the Conservative Party as an electoral force left a vacuum on the right wing, with no other contenders. UKIP had long since been abandoned as any sort of political force and had become a magnet to the unhinged, which had even less chance of becoming part of any government than the Conservatives. The ground was fertile for the movement that was to coalesce with Carlos as its leader. To go back to Carlos as a person, as mentioned, we don't have many surviving diary entries. He was keen to destroy them. From what remains, they seem full of insecurities as to what he was doing. Strangely, not enough to stop his actions. If anything, they seem to have encouraged him to go further with his destruction of femaleness, in the same way that most homophobic people tend to be homosexual themselves and are dumbing down to try to resolve issues about themselves they feel uncomfortable with.
Christine holds up a notebook with some doodles.
This doodle pad was found at the back of his drawers in his office when they were liberated. He managed to destroy most of everything, perhaps hoping his followers could rewrite his legacy. It's full of drawings of what? What do they tell us? Well, architecture. It seems Carlos was enamored with early 20th century architecture. He seems to be using these constructivist designs he has been drawing to erect, no pun intended, a giant monument to the phallus. Standing over a raised opening, naturally, psychologists have pored over this image in particular to say it suggests the monument would be built after the final act of the phallus, triumphant over womanhood. Sad, really. He really seems fearful of women. Of course, there is speculation, unproven, of course, and therefore we must take it with a hefty pinch of salt that perhaps Carlos's hatred was more to do with him being trans, or perhaps gender fluid, wanting to be a woman. I personally don't agree with this argument. There are many ways in support for this form of action. Until the incel party, that is, no, I think, as demonstrated by the massive phalluses on this drawing, and Carlos being presented of the incel areas of the dark web,
A more likely scenario is a micropenis. Small, or at least perceived, which Carlos blamed for his inability to meet women. There is little doubt in this that he was totally heterosexual. As proven with serial killers, they tend to kill the gender they desire. And this is what set him off on his path determined to make womankind pay, and pay dearly, for psychological wounds he suffered early in life. It's believed that the nascent incel movement, which spread from America, were just some creeps. Possibly some had committed rape. Most probably didn't and were just bitter. But the movement, no, not movement yet. It wasn't a movement yet. Just a view on women received a big boom when, unofficially, prostitution was encouraged by the conservative government as means for families and single women to pay the rising energy costs. The government never officially endorsed this policy, but the morality police were told not to arrest prostitutes for the time being. This, of course, led to many women not being just forced into prostitution, but beaten, assaulted, and murdered, not for drugs, not for money, but just so they could afford heating in the winter. The huge spike in sexual assaults because of so many working-class women becoming prostitutes emboldened the incel mindset, and perhaps was vital to it becoming a legitimate political force. It's insane to think, but the damage to people and society by successive conservative governments meant an incel political force was a much more viable option. All they had to do was promise they wouldn't raise taxes. They also had a simple slogan for their first political run: Fuck the matriarchy. Fuck the matriarchy. Fuck the matriarchy. Men were bitter, longing for something to blame. The coalition, led by Liberal Democrats, improved the situation marginally. But the incel party under Carlos's tutelage were able to siphon the hatred and hard done to men that they had felt and convinced them that it was women's fault. They were the ones whose greed led to the rise in energy costs. After all, the Conservative Party was led by women, unlike any other political party. Women were all whores and prostitutes. Not the fact that the money from the prostitution was essential to keep their children clothed and fed, but instead, they were just greedy for money and untrustworthy, cuckolding of any man. This viewpoint was accepted en masse. The only group who seemed oblivious to the oncoming political revolt were the mass media, who just assumed either another coalition of the left or the right. And then a general election, and the ascension to power of the incel party. Propaganda is a monologue. It does not want a response, but an echo.
Funny how things mattered so much until they don't. The revolution, I'm sorry, it wasn't called the revolution, was it? The change that occurred in the late 2030s when Downing Street was attacked by nearly 1 million ordinary people, Number 10 set fire to, a few civil servants killed. I have to briefly go back and make a comment on the masterful use of language we have in this country. It really is a masterclass in agitprop. When the UK was one, it was called Great Britain, the marketing genius of the British civil servant to insert great. In the 17th century, the last time the UK was invaded by the Dutch, it wasn't an invasion, but the Glorious Revolution. The UK wasn't locked in a civil war between Northern Ireland and Ireland. It was merely the Troubles. By the time the Incel Party had begun auto-defend mass burnings of women, in the final few months, it was not as a result of the dehumanization of one group of humans naturally leads to this kind of behavior, but because the women represented biological heresy. The Incel Party, of course, took note of these disturbances and civil unrest. We like to convince ourselves of the inherent right-wing nature of fascism. We forget it was born out of socialism in Italy, and that in the early days, Nazi ideology was also born out of left-wing solutions. Let's not forget the word socialism in National Socialism. The Incel Party correctly gambled that the intellectual worshipped dictatorship as long as it came in the form of left-wing ideology.
The whole point of democracy, after all, is to raise the proletariat to the stupidity of the bourgeoisie.
We've been here before with brutal regimes using democracy to take over and then commit brutal atrocities on its own people. The thing is, the fault sadly only lies within the regimes. In as much as they acted out of self-interest, they got voted in. The real fault lies with the falling democratic governments who mismanaged the economy through greed or incompetence, or, as Boris Johnson regime ably demonstrated, both. That leads people to vote in hideous regimes they would in normal circumstances not look twice at. Need I remind anyone of the fact the 2020s also saw the first French government consisting of the Front National due to the mass disapproval of Emmanuel Macron and his political party personality cult En Marche? Returning to a previous point, the Incel Party under Carlos Ghosn tutorship was able to co-opt left-wing elements and leading intellectuals in its initial phase, leading to the power by promising reform and redistribution and condemning the more traditional elements of the right. Likewise, it also attracted right-wing support via secret financing and promised to protect institutions from further attacks. Thus, the lead up to the first electoral win and formation of the government, everyone knew what was coming. When Carlos took to various TV and radio interviews promising progressive extermination, everyone knew death and wholesale death at that was coming. It was just everyone was fine about it because everyone assumed it was the people they despised who the party was going to liquidate. In a way, it was at the nature of misogyny is universal.
Pause.
The Incel Party could not have attained power had it not been for the tacit support of the Scottish National Party. In a series of secret meetings, Carlos had promised the SNP leaders what no other British government, Conservative, Labour, or Lib Dem led, had ever done. The Incel Party promised at its finest task would be to allow the breakup of the Union, in that Scotland would be declared an independent nation, leaving a new nation behind, knowing subsequently as the Democratic Republic of Britain and Wales. British overseas terrorists would continue to be run by Westminster, but the links became even more tenuous. Even with Northern Ireland, that Carlos in interviews felt should be returned to the Irish, the die was cast. The Incel Party had brought loyalty. The people were so downbeat and violent, they sought new answers. With that in mind, Carlos Englander was to become the violent leader of our nation, a fact that he never really sought to hide, though questions need tough answers. As several successive Tory MPs declared, even when the percentage of homeless people in the UK had reached 37%. In Carlos's inauguration speech, he admitted openly to a rapturous crowd that, interestingly, was 60-40 men, women. Talk about turkeys voting for Christmas. That democracy was not permanent anymore. Then feudalism, monarchy, fascism, or communism were. 2 days after elections, 2 decrees were passed, the first promising full independence for Scotland, and in time, the rest of the British Republic's territories. And second, the removal of the rights of women.
Now,
Had the policy of removal of rights from women been seriously suggested 15,
20 years earlier, it would have been rebuked with the disgust it deserved.
but by the 2040s in the UK, in which just paying for fuel had made millions homeless,
The desperation and violence that had become regular for at least 70% of the population meant it was accepted.
women may well be the root to all evil, as many thought.
After all, not only was there precedence biblically,
With Eve and the apple,
but it was first under Liz Truss's tutelage as Prime Minister that the first wave of mass evictions and the establishment of shanty towns up and down the nation as people could no longer afford to live in their homes due to the spiraling energy costs.
was this because she was female?
After all, what was the point of a government if it can't stop ridiculous energy hikes?
It could only be because she was encouraging it.
Apart from Scotland becoming a new nation,
Not much else happened in the first few months.
the police became tougher.
You started to see them beat youths publicly, and you began to notice the amount of female staff roll back until they were all men.
The economy began to grow after the energy companies proposed another hike.
Carlos demanded a drop of around 65%.
The energy companies laughed at this.
Then 3 of the board of directors disappeared, and the cost of fuel dropped dramatically.
He earned huge plaudits for this accomplishment. Finally, someone was doing something. Now it was time for him to deal with the other great evil in society, women.
Misery,
Dissatisfaction,
poverty,
racism.
misogyny. These thoughts tend to tessellate together. Let us now turn to Carlos. What we know of Mr. Englander through fragments from diary entries not destroyed.
The party had access to architecture.
The architecture stood solely in another dimension of thought that they had exclusive access to.
The party's role in reshaping the nation was thus to remap reality until its contours were broken and reshaped to fit the dimensions of the mind.
It would mean mass lubrication of the ship of stage by means of human blood.
There would be untold suffering.
It was vital.
It was necessary
The new society would be a society that would devalue human women.
to the new status of breeding stock, of who cow.
Was the outcome.
Many would have to die.
Although they did not realize in future times the party would inevitably acknowledge their suffering and bestow titles and honors upon them borrowed from Catholic ideology.
These patron saints of Catholicism were tortured and executed by the very institutions that now venerated them.
Here we have not just the ramblings of a madman,
But someone with a vision who acknowledges the huge female Holocaust is wrong, and that those killed in death will have a part to play in the regime.
it's audacious as it is insane.
Carlos Englander was more than just another corrupt politician and prime minister, the likes of which we are very familiar with in this country.
He was something deeper and darker.
The nihilistic nature of the human condition made flesh.
Perhaps in that respect, he is closer to any concept of Christ than we have ever seen.
Christine reads from another document.
Here is a small surviving entry. We have to keep some women alive.
This is the real politic.
Then another short piece. Misogyny is a female illusion.
Another short piece reads, "Debasement of the whore is vital for democracy."
And plummeting birth rates are due to the death instinct so prevalent in the female psyche.
She is a schizophrenic construct.
She is designed to conceive and nurture, but she secretly lusts after destruction.
We are already in these fragments beginning to build a mental image of Carlos,
Confused.
alternating between acknowledging the horror of the architecture of the mass slaughter and believing it is right and correct.
There is clearly misogyny here.
Carlos and the leading incel party members, including the few women I would add, hate women,
But he is confused.
racked by guilt.
We know that after the final solution began in Nazi Germany, Hitler refused to discuss the mass slaughter of Jews.
And would avoid any discussion.
Guilt, or more likely fear, of what will result from these murderous, bloodthirsty activities.
More fragments reveal an increasingly strange and disassociated personality.
It is becoming more apparent I will not meet my father, as he was aborted several decades before I was born.
Therefore, at subsequent mass would almost certainly have eroded to dust by now.
Carlos knew his place in history.
Knew the pointless brutality he as architect of.
Here is more fragments of Carlos.
The present is merely an echo of the future.
An echo can be made to invert if the meaning is strong enough.
He knew,
Perhaps that's why he did it.
saw the futility of existence and saw the only meaning as being one of transcending the corporal now through a legacy.
At this stage, does it even matter if the legacy is good or bad?
We have already discussed the nihilism so pervasive in our culture,
Beginning with the apocalyptic zealous of green issues.
through to the dead bodies building up in the streets in the late 2020s and 30s due to unaffordable raises in energy costs.
Through to the systematic genocide of womankind.
You don't arrive at genocide by accident, but the systematic erosion of a point to existence.
Pause.
Single females from poorer backgrounds were the most vulnerable, as they had little to no protection under the new laws.
The laws drawn up 6 months into the regime reclassified women as the following: potential breeders,
These are women between 14 and 40.
breeders,
Healthy women, 18 to 34.
biological incubators,
Those that have already been impregnated.
slave labor,
This was key to the rebuilding the economy of Britain, which had been on life support, which following the crash of 07-08 and was in freefall post-Brexit and COVID pandemic.
By using women as slave labor and not paying them, they achieved huge building projects and attracted lots of investment overseas, were over enthusiastic by being able to invest in areas which not only consisted of no trade unions, but that workers had no choice but work. This brings me to the final classification. They were known as the euphemism
Labor surplus.
These women, unable to conceive, unattractive, either told or young to work or be used as prostitutes. These women were the first to be executed in the first auto-de-burning ceremony. To quickly jump back to a previous point, the forcing women into prostitution and to be raped and often gang raped brought in huge tourism to the British and Welsh republics. The economy grew enormously and was referred to as the economic miracle. Carlos Englander became popular abroad despite the fact the population growth was built on rape, murder, and slave labor, but it made money. Huge amounts of money at a time when the global economy was getting poorer. You might think there would be an outcry. There was the usual voices raised, but money talked. Carlos did his best to woo leaders abroad, and for a time, it worked, especially as the secret deal between the SNP An incel party meant they refused to criticize. The policies were also popular here, not amongst women who revisited initially and were beaten and raped, sometimes executed and dumped in mass graves by the police. Many men bought into the novelty that they could force women into sex.
And their wife or girlfriend couldn't say no. He couldn't even force them to have sex, and the law was on his side. It wasn't just sex crimes that appealed. The fact that you could beat women in public, it very quickly became the new norm.
The
The
incel
Party also gained support by keeping a few women in government to make their policies not seem so bad. But also to appeal to the Creole law by demonstrating how not allowing women to consume meat or use as much fuel as these policies were in fact making the British Republic more green on earth. This policy also raised widows abroad and policies everywhere applauded the The man had almost assumed the role of breadwinner after suicide and decades earlier depression. The first official, and as far as we know, mass murders of women and females. The argument for this based on economics. Large figures saved criminals alive. No, these criminals rather prison as a deliberate attempt to dehumanize the subject. The money was from to go to what by the time when incel party ascension to power was adequately acquired. And in return, exactly what we are once again popular British people, both right-wing and shockingly right-wing media laughed this idea up. The women were then killed by barbarians, locking them in their cells to die of starvation. Most did. A few managed to escape, but a regiment of British Army were meant to gun them down. The military had secretly been money, and the high outside also been promised possibly once things settled down to try out new weapons. Following a successful the policy was not for the sake of policy was not said that once rising men there were all there was no going back. No matter was an official state policy that no one could refute.
The testimonials of what some of these women survivors witnessed, what I saw. This is the first time I've spoken like this. My wife was killed in the extermination center located just outside Wolverhampton. The first and largest of the extermination centers, known to most people as the Walsall Ghetto. You see, in the beginning, after the female prisoners were killed, the incel party still used caution and masked their activities by killing humanely. The extermination centers initially used gas. Naturally, this had a rebound effect for the economy as the gases were manufactured here. Also supplied new employment perspectives for men creating and shipping the gas. However, in the final year, the auto da fe began the mass burnings in public. There were several key sites in London, Manchester, and Birmingham, where around 300 women would be mass burned on a weekend. These events proved popular with the public. Also, it seemed the newfound wealth being redistributed to men and the constant spectacle of violence and the legislation of rape, as long as it was by a man on a woman, lowered the crime rates, in particular, violent crime. So, we've established the necessary elements in place to deliver a strong democracy into the most brutal tyranny. The one factor all tyrannies share is they kill far more of their own population than anyone else. Remember, there is no such thing as a benevolent dictatorship, be it left-wing, right-wing, theocracy, or atheistic in nature. You show me one party state anywhere in the world and you will find a mountain of corpses. Beware of anyone, no matter how much you agree with what they're fighting for, who want to force their beliefs on others. So we have also established what the incel party country looked like. How the nation changed from the UK to the British republics of Britain and Wales, how the government received support from abroad, how it didn't take much for the mass persecution of women to be accepted, how people never learn their lesson and will always follow prophets promising change and will always take the risk because of their hatred and distrust of established politicians. Naturally, this is because when times are good, politicians let themselves and the nation state down due to corruption. Rape culture led naturally to the mass spread of sexually transmitted diseases and infections. Antibiotics were handed out to every male regularly since the late 2030s. An elite kept one of the UK's nuclear plants, and the inability to afford to fix this, iodide tablets were handed out as a cheaper way to solve the issue, so there was at least some sort of precedent for this. Recent sociologists have discussed the concept of the totalitarian personality, that is, young men who
have grown up believing in nothing. Their only sense of place in the world was that of the incel party. Most newspapers were shut down. The BBC was shut down, although not having to pay for a license anymore actually proved a popular policy and helped the incels party longevity. Mondo Misogynistico was the first state-sponsored propaganda film made by the new regime. The video, shot in a lurid cinema verite style, demonstrates the popular nature of the new dehumanization of women laws and how this is beneficial to everyone in society and how everyone is so much happier. The video was shown widespread in the UK, but was essentially made for other nations to show that there was nothing to fear from the new government, no distribution to trade or business, and in fact, the new policies were very popular and designed to be beneficial to all, not just a minority. In the final year of its existence, the Incel Party made the phallic fascia, the symbol of Italian fascism, the official standard of the nation. In these death throes as unrest grew, no one was spared. In fact, the few female cabinet ministers were all rounded up during a cabinet meeting. Their heads were shaved, and they were publicly burned. These final auto-da-fe was believed to have been committed to quell the growing agitation by demonstrating bloodlust at the highest level. It didn't work. The nation witnessed too much violence and misery. The end was nigh for the movement. It is often said that madmen never die. Nothing troubles them, so they live forever. This belief in the infallibility of the insane dictator is often mentioned. The biggest mass murderers of the 20th century, bar Hitler, all died peacefully in their sleep, secure in their power and control. Bizarrely, the Incel Party
never changed the electoral system to a dictatorship. They never proclaimed a dictatorship of the proletariat, or simply did away with democracy and other political parties altogether. Nor did Carlos make himself president for life and impeachable. The government went to the elections, or would have done had the armed residents, who ironically used less legal means in their violent uprising to bring down Carlos Englander and the Incel Party leaders. Why? Did Carlos assume people would vote him and his movement in? Had he thought he and the nation and crossed the Rubicon through the brutal bloodletting and genocide of women as being human beings, that self-reflection under another party would be too difficult. And so, like Macbeth, had to continue wading through the river of blood? Did he not care? Did guilt drive him to some form of self-destructive behavior? We don't know. Diaries were kept and destroyed. He wasn't insane unless he was high functioning. He must have known what may well have happened, and yet he deliberately seemed not to protect himself. As the female-led resistance swept throughout the nation, he seemed to react less and less to his own survival instincts, try and calm the unrest by killing more and more women. But perhaps it's impossible to truly get inside people like Carlos Englander's mindset. On the subject of Carlos Englander's mindset, I would like to read a few more remaining fragments of diary entries to try and get some kind of insight into his mind. Almost beautiful. Something truly unique is going on that I can't quite define. The party has emerged out of a misdirected catharsis. Market economics are divinely sent by God. The guerrilla warfare against the incel party grew with the strongest factions being the Maoist factions, who were to inform the next government of the British and Welsh republics. Initially, these factions were seen in a very poor light by various overseas factions and the IMF, with the pound running at 20.03 to the $1 US dollar. But the Maoists just routed a sharp grasp on the economics and the importance of capitalism. They also proved that rentals and shooting many of the Republican incel party members and those deemed sympathizers. One thing the Maoists had learned from the incel party was democracy was truly ended in Britain and Wales in the 21st century from communist dictatorship established with most of the House of Lords exiled or imprisoned. The economy had established money to the Maoists freely was massively deteriorated for both genders. There's no doubt women's rights are somewhat improved. No sign under the incel party. There's no sign of a return to the days of democratic government.
Carlos deleted his diaries. Almost all of Carlos recovered and committed suicide by drinking acid. His final words are quoted.
Suicide by drinking acid. His final words are quoted as the incel party died of embolism.
The incel movement went to ground.
And still commits random acts of terror.
Hoping for the day it can return to power.
There's nothing left to say.
Audience member suddenly jumps up. For Carlos, bitch! Lights go out, sound of gunshots. Lights come back up. Christine lies dead on the stage as theater security have grappled the man to the floor. Close the curtains now! Curtain close. The end. La fin. Yay! Take a bow. Maybe just move it, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, we're
Yeah. Here we go. Take the bow. 3, 2, 1. Yay! We want you to look at each other and bow together. And yay!
Thank you, Ben. Thank you to Grant.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you to Peter,
Yes, thank you to
Thank you, audience, for being here.
Thank you, Galena Library.
Thank you, library.
Yes.
All right. Screw on out and I'll wrap up. Amazing. Thank you all so much. Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm just going to grab my iPad. I'll be right back. Had to go through some technical difficulties and figure some stuff out while it was happening so I could make them look spectacular. Okay. Amazing. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for being here. We cannot do this without your support It means so much to have a virtual audience coming in and seeing the wonders just straight from their homes or wherever they are. We have some folks that are coming from all over the world, so thank you all so much for being here. If you like what you see, again, feel free to donate to our GoFundMe at the Theater You Know Instagram, which you can follow up with me, or go to our Instagram at Theater You Know. Other than that, thank you all so much for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure. Come back for day 3. We have our final day tomorrow. And with that, I wish you good night. Thank you all so much. Take care. Bye-bye.